for this talk was supposed to be originally about Syria, and by popular demand and the events that are taking place, it was thought that we need to talk more about Iran, even though we had a program a while back on Iran. I hope we'll have a chance to get to the Syria issue today, but if not, maybe reschedule it for another time, because it's related, obviously, but it deserves a lot more time on its own, especially given how much misinformation is out there among people like yourselves. So I'm not particularly an expert on Iran, although I follow the Middle East in general very closely, as close as I can. And we're going to get into some detail, but for the time being, frankly, if you look at this slide and understand it, that's everything you need to know, really the key thing you need to know about the current crisis between the U.S. and Iran. Obviously, there's some history and some details, but think of yourself as an Iranian and look at this map, which graphically reflects their reality, and you wonder why they see the U.S. as an adversary. So the current round of crisis began with the U.S. assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, an Iraqi general and leader of the popular militia forces, in Baghdad, at the Baghdad airport, on January 2nd. That was ordered by Trump. You probably have followed a lot of the news. Without going into a lot of detail, unfortunately, most of the response in the political mainstream has reinforced the idea that Soleimani was a bad man that deserved to die. Only Trump should have told Congress first, or maybe he shouldn't have killed him right now because that was reckless. But that's sort of the range of opinion that we get, and is decidedly unreal given his actual role in the Middle East. And there's a lot of debate or commentary about whether this was legal or not because Congress was not told ahead of time. Frankly, whether Congress was told ahead of time or not, an international assassination of a political leader in another country is illegal under international law, particularly as it took place in a third country. So there's no question that whether Congress agreed or not, and this is something we get into in this country, if Congress says it's okay, it's okay. Well, there happens to be a system of international law that supersedes anything that Congress does, and we are a signatory to the UN Charter and many treaties that forbid unilateral acts of military violence or assassination on foreign territory. But of course, you all know this has been U.S. policy for many, many, many years, going back decades. That is, covertly or overtly to assassinate foreign leaders that are regarded as adversaries of the United States. So, sorry? You can't see this? Okay. If you can just dim the ones in the front, that would be good. The other way around.
No, the other way around. That's the one.
If you turn on the other one, so. Yeah, is that good?
Yes.
I don't want people to fall asleep. I know when the lights are down, that's what happens to me. So why was this act of war, why did it take place? The Trump administration claimed sort of ridiculously that Soleimani was planning imminent attacks against the United States, and therefore this was a preventive action. In fact, the UN Charter does allow defense against imminent strikes, but not against a political leader far from the battlefield. It allows a preemptive strike against units or elements that are actually about to carry out an attack. That certainly wasn't the case here. The hostility to Iran is sometimes posed in the nature of its supposed program to develop nuclear weapons, its repressive nature of its regime, but the real basis for the hostility is the fact that Iran is the leader of an axis of resistance in the Middle East that is outside of and opposed to the sort of U.S. hegemonic power in the region, which is based, of course, on Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the other Gulf monarchies. The Islamic Republic of Iran has a lot of support in post-Saddam Hussein Iraq, and of course is allied with the government of Syria and with Hezbollah, which is both a militia and part of the government of Lebanon. And in our press, it's often talked about that this is a Shia movement. And in fact, of course, Iran is majority Shia Islam, and the US-aligned countries, other than Israel, are primarily Sunni Muslim. But the religious aspect of this conflict shouldn't be exaggerated. Saudi Arabia had no trouble having cordial relations with Shia Iran when it was ruled by the Shah and was aligned with American interests, for example. The government in Syria that the Iranians support is led primarily by Alawites, members of an offshoot of Islam that is not exactly Shia, although for convenience purposes, both sides pretend that it is part of Shia Islam. But the primary attitude of the government of Syria is secularism, and not any particular adherence to Shia Islam. And of course now, because Yemen has been attacked by Saudi Arabia, it's also part of this more or less anti-US alignment in the Middle East. So the US and Israel and Saudi Arabia have been against Iran since 1979, and it's not primarily because the Islam in Islamic Republic, but from the point of view of the Saudis, it's the Republic part of Islamic Republic. The Saudi and other Gulf monarchies are terrified of Iran because it demonstrates the possibility of having a pious Islamic regime in a republican setting and not a monarchical setting. So the tit for tat you've all followed, as usual in our press, they choose when to start the narrative. In fact, so you could say, as Trump claims, the Iranian proxies in Iraq shelled the U.S. base and killed an American citizen who actually was a naturalized Iraqi member of the Special Forces. And then the U.S. retaliated supposedly by bombing a number of bases of Iraqi Shia militias, killing 30 or so people. Then the Iraqis responded by demonstrating at the U.S. Embassy in Iran, again, always called proxies. Remember, our enemies, local enemies, are always called proxies of somebody else, but our allies are never called proxies of the United States. You'll never hear the expression, the Saudi proxy forces in Yemen, or the Israeli proxy forces in the Golan Heights. It's part of the sort of standard media one-sided view. Of course, Iran does have influence in the region, and there are forces in the various countries that are friendly toward Iran, but they act on their own and in the interests of their own countries with the support and sometimes the backing of Iran. So, so this guy that we call a terrorist, Soleimani, was the head of the Quds Force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, which is a sort of equivalent of the Marines of Iran. And he was not just a military leader, he was a major general, but he was also, in effect, something between the Secretary of State, Foreign Minister, and Secretary of Defense for issues that related to military events and aims within the Middle East. He was a very high-ranking, he wasn't just a general, he was a very high-ranking policymaker in the Iranian government. Some people consider him the number 2 person in Iranian decision-making. Some, thought that he was going to run for president next time. And so he was an important figure and had considerable support in Iran and around the Middle East, especially in Iran because he was regarded as a war hero during Iran's resistance against the attack from Iraq in the 1980s that we'll get to. And one question before we go on, the Trump administration and their supporters around the world also condemned Iran for being not democratic. And it's true from our point of view, we shouldn't have any illusions, Iran is not a fully democratic country. But you have to ask compared to what? within the region, and admittedly it's a very low bar for democracy in the region, Iran is probably the most democratic country in the Middle East. It has elections that matter. They don't, because of the structure of the government and the religious ultimate decision-making, they don't matter 100%. But compared to the other governments in the Middle East, Iran is more democratic, although also culturally somewhat repressive, but not as culturally repressive as Saudi Arabia and other allies of the United States. So the idea that the US and its friends are hostile to Iran because it's not democratic enough or it mistreats its people is an absurdity. Okay? The least democratic country in the Middle East is the closest US ally, and that's Saudi Arabia, although you might say Israel as well. Israel is sometimes considered by US mainstream and by itself as a democracy. Of course, it can't be a democracy if it rules over 5 million Palestinians who have no say whatsoever and no citizenship in the government that controls their lives. So this idea that Israel is a democracy is an absurdity. It's a democracy if you're a Jewish Israeli, but not if you're something else. So just bear in mind, when you read reports, I mean, there are people in Iran that are rightfully dissatisfied with their government. But the fact that they can demonstrate in Iran, and they are demonstrating, and support opposing political candidates is something fairly unique, and certainly does not happen in most U.S. allies. So he was very popular, and even among Iranians who are very hostile to the government, Soleimani was regarded as a war hero and someone who had a high level of support. Something like 80% of the Iranians regarded him as an important and positive figure. On the upper right, this is part of his funeral in Iran, where 1 million people turned out in Tehran and millions more around the country. This is in Baghdad, and this is in Sana'a, Yemen. So he had a lot of support around the region. He was regarded as an important figure. Obviously not everybody, depending, because the Middle East is fractured politically. Not everybody agreed with that, but millions of people regarded him as a hero rather than a terrorist, as the U.S. Calls him. Now, terrorism, by the way, as the U.S. uses it, and Israel uses it, and South Africa used to use it, is a very slippery term, which, for the most part, if we shouldn't avoid it altogether, we should at least put it in context. Terrorism as a term is used one-sidedly to label violent acts by resistance to states and resistance to empire. Whereas the violence perpetrated by states, especially the United States, is never called terrorism. Although it has taken many, many more lives in the Middle East in modern times, and of course going back to World War II, than any combination of terrorists and dictators in the Middle East could come close to. And just as a reminder, this picture is the aftermath of the U.S. bombing of Mosul in Iraq in 1916, which basically carpet bombed the country. Yes?
2016.
Pardon?
2016.
Oh, sorry. 2016, of course. 1916, it was the British bombing Iraq. As you all know, the Iranians struck back, but in a clearly measured way that was meant to be a symbolic warning rather than an escalation of the war. They showed great restraint given the status of the leader that was assassinated. And despite what you read, Trump and the U.S. government has talked about how they had special intelligence, they knew this was coming. They knew about it because the Iranians warned the U.S. and the Iraqis that they were going to attack these bases in advance and intentionally allowed the U.S. To place its personnel on these bases into bomb shelters and aimed it as a message rather than an effort to kill a lot of American soldiers, and made it clear that this was going to be their final response, that is, for the time being. That is, this was their equivalence of it. But it was also a warning, and if you see here, it's a little fuzzy, Iran here, it was a warning that if a major war should break out, Iranian missiles can reach all the U.S. allies and bases in the Middle East, including the Gulf, Israel, and Turkey. So it was kind of warning to the U.S., and fortunately, for whatever reason, the Trump administration took it as that and sort of wound down. This is the end for the time being of the tit-for-tat back and forth. Now, this didn't just start a year ago. The current round of hostilities began when Trump unilaterally withdrew from the U.S. International treaty with Iran over its nuclear program. And things escalated. This was in May 2018. Things escalated before that. But the roots of this conflict, of course, go back much further. And although Americans don't remember it very much, Iranians certainly do. After the Iranian Revolution, which we'll come back to, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia encouraged Iraq to launch a military invasion of Iran in 1980. And they fought a war, a horribly intense war on the scale of sort of World War I casualties in trench warfare for 8 years along their borders, and including the Iraqi continued use of poison gas, whose chemical antecedents were supplied by the U.S. and Germany and other U.S. allies. And when the UN rightfully tried to condemn the Iraqi use of poison gas against the Iranians, the U.S. blocked action in the UN. And this famous picture down below, at the very time when when Iraq was using poison gas both against the Iranians and its own Kurdish population, Donald Rumsfeld was in Iraq shaking Saddam Hussein's hand. The Iranians suffered as many as 500,000 deaths in this war, and between $500 billion and $1 trillion in economic damage. It was a catastrophe for them. They ultimately basically repelled the Iraqi invasion, and a peace took place in 1988 that essentially kept the borders where they were. So it was kind of a stalemate, which for the Iranians was a victory, because Iraq was backed by the U.S. and all the other regional powers.
Hey, Jeff, question,
Yeah.
why would Iraq do that? Why did they do that?
They were encouraged. This was after the Iranian Revolution.
Yeah.
They believed the old Iranian army was basically dissolved. The U.S. and the Saudis wanted to weaken or overthrow the government of Iran, and they paid Saddam Hussein for the cost of his war and gave him diplomatic and political coverage. This was the hope of overthrowing the new Iranian Republic. So it was during that war, as a reminder, that the U.S. shot down an Iranian civilian airliner over the Straits of Hormuz, killing 290 people. And we need to bear this in mind. There's been a lot of publicity lately on the horrific accidental shooting down of a civilian Ukrainian airliner over Tehran, for which the Iranians have apologized profusely and really, offered their sincere condolences. When a U.S. ship shot down this Iranian airliner, not only did President George Bush not apologize then, the captain of this ship and many of its officers were given medals for outstanding conduct after the war. So contrast that. I mean, obviously this was an accident, like the recent accident, not something out of the blue, an accident in the context of war, but the Iranians are sorry, the U.S. were kind of bragging about it. So we're going to step back a little bit and look at the Middle East as a whole. Hopefully this map will be familiar to most of you, maybe more so than it was some years ago. The satirical writer Ambrose Bierce is supposed to have said once that war is God's way of teaching geography to Americans. I think so. The Middle East is something that we're more familiar with these days. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Israel, and the occupied territories, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So that's the geographic map of the Middle East. This is the way the same region looks to the Pentagon. They call it, not the Middle East, they call it the Central Command. It includes all those countries of the Middle East except Turkey. And Turkey is not there because as a NATO member, it's part of the European Command, not the Middle Eastern Command, even though it's physically in the Middle East. And just as a reminder, for the first time that I'm aware of in history, the U.S. military has divided up the entire globe into military command. So the CENTCOM, as it's called, the Central Command, is only one of a half a dozen military command. Eurocom, AFRICOM, SouthernCom, NORDCom, you know, and the Pacific Command, which includes the entire globe, are regarded as theaters of military operations.
Now we have SpaceCom too.
Space-Con, yeah.
Yes.
Please come.
And just by the way, although there are obviously, I'm going to show you various U.S. facilities in the Middle East, the headquarters of CENTCOM is in Tampa, Florida, which is 7,500 miles away from the Gulf. So this will give you an idea of the U.S. military presence in terms of actual bases, which is, this is a graphic from the Washington Post on the left. The U.S. has about 61,000 troops at any one time over bases in most Middle Eastern countries, plus thousands more on the various aircraft carrier battle groups that come and go to the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea.
Jeff,
yeah.
excuse me a minute. Is there a way to get it focused a little better? Am I the only one that's seeing it?
No.
Okay.
Better?
Eye chart improves.
Okay. It's not, the resolution on this projector is not so great,
Thank
unfortunately.
you.
So actually, this graphic underestimates the U.S. military presence in the Middle East, and this one, at least, you know, itemizes it a little in more expanse. The U.S. is involved with military bases, military aid, training missions, or invasions in every single country in the Middle East. Every single country in the Middle East except for one, Iran. So in this graphic, I don't know if you can see it, it shows the troop numbers in any one of these countries, and there's a big zero, goose egg here in Iran. So this is the military posture of the U.S. in the Middle East, and it reflects a U.S. imperial domination of the region, which is maybe illustrated, the purpose of which is illustrated in this next somewhat tongue-in-cheek map. This is another way that the U.S. looks at the Middle East, and although it may bring a smile, it's pretty accurately expresses the U.S. strategic interest in the Middle East. And we'll get to some detail in a minute. Up until the Second World War, or the 1930s at least, most of the oil in the Middle East that had been discovered and was beginning to be exploited was under the control of the British in Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait. And in fact, the first big foreign oil company in the Middle East was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company that was founded in 1906 through various permutations of its name. It still exists today. It's called BP. The U.S., given that the British sort of had control of the Middle East, the U.S. was kind of a newcomer, but they managed to get the exclusive exploration rights in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were interested in counterbalancing British power in the Middle East and saw the U.S. as a suitably faraway power that was going to have economic relations, but probably not colonial interests in the Middle East, unlike the British, which were the sort of hyper-colonial power. So in 1933, the Saudis signed an oil exploration agreement with a consortium of U.S. companies, primarily the California Standard Oil Company. This was one of the regional oil companies that resulted from the breakup of the great Rockefeller conglomerate of Standard Oil. Standard Oil of California, joined later by Texaco, and then Standard Oil of New Jersey, set up the California Standard Oil Company, CASOC, headquartered in San Francisco, to explore for oil in Saudi Arabia, and they discovered it in 1938. And of course, it became the biggest oil discovery then known. And you need to understand that despite all the emphasis in the Middle East today of U.S. relations with Israel and so on, the oldest U.S. ally in the Middle East, and this is because of oil, is Saudi Arabia. The U.S. was allied with Saudi Arabia long before Israel came into existence. And very importantly, Franklin Roosevelt, when he was on his way home from the Yalta Conference, practically on his deathbed, stopped on a U.S. ship in the Suez Canal to meet with King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia to sort of formally establish this alliance. And we have a little film clip that hopefully will work. This is from a PBS
After exchanging
documentary.
gifts, they got down to business. America needed to lease an airport and Navy refueling station for its war against Japan. But it was the security of the Saudi kingdom that was at the forefront of King Abdulaziz's concerns. He requested U.S. military assistance and training, and they agreed to construct the Dhahran military base.
The base which still exists today.
In return, the king guaranteed that the U.S. would always have secure access to Saudi oil.
America struck a pact with Saudi Arabia. You give us oil at cheap prices and we will give you protection. This protection eventually evolved into an American hegemony over the entire Gulf region, and the deal extended to the Gulf region, that this was an American area of influence, and in return for this, it shall be protected from all enemies.
So this was the first direct large-scale U.S. entry into the Middle East, and even Roosevelt, who was against the old-fashioned kind of colonialism, but in favor of kind of a new version of economic colonialism, made it clear to the British what this meant.
Roosevelt had been convinced by his Home Secretary, Harold Ickes, also responsible for oil policy, that he must declare Saudi Arabia to lie within the American area of interest. To the British ambassador in Washington, he said,
"The Persian oil is all yours. The oil in Iraq and Kuwait we will share. As to the Saudi oil, it belongs to us."
Not to the Saudis, but if you can get the lights on again. So this was Franklin Roosevelt, not Donald Trump. And so this alliance with Saudi Arabia and the exchange of Saudi oil for U.S. protection is something that has continued today since the 1940s. And by the way, a reminder, in the 1940s, the U.S. was a huge oil exporter, as it is somewhat today. The U.S. never needed oil from Saudi Arabia or any of the Middle Eastern countries, but control of that oil was enormously profitable. It was U.S. oil companies that primarily got the oil out of the ground and built the infrastructure and took the profits from it. And strategically, control of this oil is enormously important in terms of U.S. control over potential adversaries. For instance, the Chinese get almost all their oil from the Middle East, and it comes by sea, and they are plenty worried that in a crisis, the U.S. should cut off their oil supplies, which is one reason why they're trying to build this land bridge through Asia into the Middle East, so that their oil sources will be immune from U.S. attack. So, just a reminder, the current cozy relationship with Saudi Arabia is not a Republican policy or a Democratic policy. It's a policy of U.S. elites that has very little dissent for decades. And our sainted ex-President Obama was as much sucking up to the Saudis as our current demon in the White House, Trump. Now, the origins of this, the current hostility with Iran go back principally to the Cold War, even further. If the 1980s seemed like ancient history to people, the Cold War is prehistoric to most of us, and if we have time later on, in fact, the roots of conflict in the Middle East go back to the First World War, which is 100 years ago. But the Cold War, which began in Europe, soon spread. The rivalry between the Soviet bloc and the U.S. and its allies spread from Europe around the world, and especially to the Middle East, where oil was regarded as so strategic. Even though communism was never a serious threat in the Middle East, the U.S. chose to consider independent nationalism within that region as akin to communism, something that they had to oppose. And the first main event of this armed confrontation in the Middle East took place in Iran in 1953. And hopefully this will play. I forget whether this clip will explain it, but there was an Iranian government elected in 1951 that moved to nationalize Iranian oil, which was then had been controlled and was under lease by the British Iranian Petroleum Company. And the current agreement with Britain said that the British kept 90% of the oil and the Iranians got 10%. And this was even worse than the U.S. agreement with the Saudis, which was 50-50. But that 50% to U.S. oil companies was gigantic. So the Iranians moved to nationalize their oil, and the British were against it and asked for the U.S. to help.
The new American President Eisenhower and his Secretary of State Dulles already saw all of the Mideast fall under Soviet influence. There was only one solution. Mossadegh had to be overthrown. Head of CIA, Alan Dulles, the brother of the Secretary of State, was assigned Operation Ajax, to which London had agreed. Mossadegh was to be replaced by a general loyal to the Shah. The tide changed within a few days. Now the masses demonstrated for the Shah, stirred up by the army, which stormed Mossadegh's villa. Old Mossy could only escape by jumping across the garden fence. As planned, General Sahidi, head of the army and loyal to the Shah, took over command and distributed copies of the letter of dismissal from Mossadegh to the journalists. The next morning in Rome, the Shah boarded a plane and returned to Tehran. In the meantime, Mossadegh had been arrested at his country estate. A court sentenced him to 3 years in prison. After he served his term, he was placed under lifelong house arrest.
آدم خیلی صادقی بود. اصطلاح آدم خیلی پاکی بود.
He was an honest man, a great Democrat. And during his government we achieved a maximum of democracy, justice and independence. The more time goes by, the more students and young people realize that during this period we were having the best time of our lives.
In his diary, President Eisenhower wrote about the CIA's success. The Operation Ajax seemed more like a dime novel than a historical fact. The Shah had come out of the crisis more self-confident and with the will to consolidate his power, which was to be reflected in his coronation. He also didn't want the British back. The oil and the facilities remained in national possession, but for management and distribution, he needed a new partner. The Americans seized the opportunity. Under their leadership, they formed a consortium made up of 7 Western oil companies, among them 4 American, and the British Anglo-Persian as a minority shareholder. From all revenues, the Shah received half. The oil from Abadan was flowing again.
So this last part is about as important as the overthrow of the Shah because it was one of the first major blows for the U.S. replacing the British as the predominant imperial power in the Middle East. This is 1953 again. And they did it by taking credit for overthrowing the democratic government of Iran, aligning with the Shah, and giving the Iranians a better deal on their oil, 50-50 as opposed to 90-10. And of course, Iran then, pro-U.S. Iran, became one of the sort of staple pillars of U.S. support in the Middle East. A couple of years after the overthrow of Mossadegh, the U.S. engineered the creation of what was called the Baghdad Pact, that is all the sort of U.S. and British-oriented governments in the region, mostly non-Muslim, as a matter of fact, including Iran, Pakistan, Turkey. And because the U.S. still hoped that the British could be its sort of local proconsul in the Middle East, the U.S. was not a member of this pact. The U.K. was. But it didn't last very long. The Suez Crisis in 1956, in which the British and French were forced ignominiously to abandon their attack on the Suez Canal and Egypt by the U.S., demanding that they do so, led the U.S. government and Eisenhower to believe that we had to begin to sort of take a more direct role in running the Middle East. And Eisenhower in 1957 issued what became the Eisenhower Doctrine, that is, the U.S. would oppose communism in the Middle East wherever it showed itself. And by communism, again, the U.S. meant countries that were nationalist or socialist and not allied with the U.S. Again, there was no country in the Middle East where an indigenous communist movement was about to take power. There were only a few countries where there were strong communist movements. One was Iraq, the other was Iran, but they never threatened to take power. Communism was the sort of short version of Arab independence and secular nationalism. In 1958, the British-imposed monarchy in Iraq was overthrown by a coup, and the British were kicked out of Iraq, and that was the final blow. The U.S. understood that the British no longer could afford to run the Middle East, and we had to do it directly on our own. And the question was how to do it. The U.S. again identified communism as the threat to the Middle East because it was convenient politically, and because we had a history since the beginning of the Cold War after 1945 of fighting communism, so-called. And in this battle, in the U.S. and then around the world, the U.S. and its allies deployed religion as an important weapon in fighting communism, godless communism, that some of you may remember from when you were little. And in the Middle East, it had a convenient ally to do that. The Saudi monarchy regarded itself as the preeminent Muslim power because it controlled the holy sites of Mecca and Medina, and was already ruled by a very fundamentalist and rigid branch of Islam, Wahhabi Islam, that went back to the 18th century. And Saudi Arabia was given the job of promoting Islam in the Middle East as an alternative to communism and nationalism. And we all know where that went. And just as a reminder, because this was not unique, religion was used to fight communism and leftism in the United States too. And I remember, probably most of you do, when Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and In God We Trust was put on our money. These don't go back indefinitely. This was done by acts of Congress in the 1950s. And In God We Trust was made the official motto of the United States. And as you know, in the labor movement, the Catholic Church, especially in New England, was mobilized to fight the left in the labor movement under this banner of fighting godless communism under God. So this whole U.S. system that was initiated under Eisenhower received a huge shock at the beginning and the end of 1979. The Shah was overthrown in January 1979, and ultimately it evolved into the Islamic Republic of Iran. In Afghanistan, a leftist government, which had taken power a couple of years before, asked for Soviet assistance in sort of defending itself against opposition, and the Soviets sent military forces to Afghanistan at the end of that year. This was a huge blow to the whole U.S. system. The U.S. was already supporting the opposition to the leftist government in Afghanistan, but after the Soviets directly intervened, they ramped it up considerably. And of course, this became the sort of touchstone in terms of Iran. The U.S. hostages became the sort of touchstone of the sort of modern hostility between the U.S. and Iraq. Carter issued what became known as the Carter Doctrine in 1980, which said that we will fight, including militarily, any outside power that sought to dominate the Middle East and its oil resources. Any outside power, any outside power other than the United States, of course. And he ramped up U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, which was financed by the Saudis primarily and organized by the secret services of Sunni Islam Pakistan. And you may remember Ronald Reagan called the Mujahideen, the holy warriors of Afghanistan, the functional equivalent of our founding fathers. They are freedom fighters. He met with them in the White House. And retrospectively, his chief security advisor of first Carter and then later for a time under the Reagan administration had this famous assessment. What's most important to the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? What could possibly go wrong with that scenario? And of course, the U.S. supplied and organized and financed Osama bin Laden and his Afghani Arabs that fought the government of Afghanistan, which led to the creation of Al-Qaeda and ultimately the 9/11 attacks on the United States and the spread of Al-Qaeda and ISIS throughout the Middle East. What could possibly go wrong? So the U.S. has been involved in wars in the Middle East since, it's often said, since the lifetime of kids who are in their 20s now, who are about to be enter the U.S. military. In fact, the U.S. has been involved directly and indirectly in wars in the Middle East for our entire lifetimes, since the 1940s. And the cost, even of the more recent decades, is trillions of dollars, thousands of American dead, and probably millions of Arab and Iranian dead during the same period. And I want to stop with this slide, which indicates the way U.S. policy has evolved over the years within the context that the overriding interest of the U.S. is hegemony in the Middle East and control of the oil, but the instrumentation of that policy has varied, and who was our ally and who was our enemy has varied over the years tremendously. So, for example, we think of the Saudis, the Israelis, and the Jordanians as our reliable allies. But before 1979, the Iranians were our most important ally in the Middle East and then became our biggest enemy. The U.S. helped the Ba'ath Party in Iraq to overthrow a leftist government in the 1970s and probably supported the installation into power of Saddam Hussein in the 1970s. We supported him when he attacked Iraq in the 1980s before he became our public enemy number one in the 1990s and afterwards. Syria, which is now, competes with Iran to be the most horrific adversary of the United States in the Middle East, was an ally of the U.S. when we attacked Iraq in 1991. The CIA used to send prisoners to be interrogated and probably tortured in Syria after 9/11. And it wasn't until 2007 that Syria became one of the prime enemies. Remember before that, Hillary Clinton visited Syria, Nancy Pelosi visited Syria, but for changes in U.S. policy, they became part of the enemy camp after 2007, and so on and so forth. So the friends and enemies vary, but the U.S. policy is constant. That is, to control the region by any means necessary. So I want to stop here for some questions and discussion before, if and when we get to Syria, the question of Syria, which I'd like to, but I know you might have some comments or further questions about Iran. Yeah.
Well, there's very, very little mention of consideration of the sanctions on Iran yet.
Of what? Sorry?
The sanctions.
Yes.
On Iran yet. Iran's economy has been totally crippled by the sanctions on Iran. I think 25%, 75% of the oil from Iran has been sanctioned effectively by the United States, which means that the whole economy is totally crippled. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Thank you. I meant to mention that and just slipped my mind when I was talking about it. So since the purpose of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, was to in return for transparency and an ultra secure regime of inspections of Iran's civilian nuclear projects, that sanctions which had existed against Iran previously would be removed. And that was the agreement between Obama and the Iranian leadership, and it was a quid pro quo. That is, Iran, which has never, as far as we can tell, had a determined program to develop nuclear weapons, and is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But there was a lot of clamor about their civilian nuclear program, and they agreed to limit it beyond what they were required to do under the Non-Proliferation Treaty in return for the removal of sanctions. But when Trump withdrew from the treaty in May of 2018, he reimposed sanctions that were even worse than the sanctions that had existed before. He called it his maximum pressure campaign. And worse than that, I mean, a country, even for bad reasons, has the right to refuse to trade with what they consider an adversary. So if that's all that Trump did, that would be bad enough, but it would be legal, so to speak. But because of the centrality of the dollar and the US banking system within the whole circulation of international trade, Trump was able to shut off most of Iranian trade with other countries besides the United States. That has almost stopped them from exporting oil anywhere and from importing, very important products. Even though supposedly humanitarian goods were exempted, the way these sanctions actually work in Iran, in Syria, in Venezuela, is that they make it very difficult to get medical equipment and medical supplies as well as anything else. So the Iran economy suffered greatly. Fortunately for the Iranians, they are not, even though oil is an important part of their national income, they are not a petromonarchy like Saudi Arabia or the UAE. They have actually other economy, so that the country did not reach a total point of collapse, but the people suffer a lot. And of course, that's what these sanctions do. It's a kind of terrorism. It's an attempt to make the people suffer enough to change their government to get out from under the sanctions. And this is what happened in Nicaragua, for instance, in the 1980s. The Nicaraguans were faced with either you'll suffer indefinitely under our sanctions and our military attacks, or you'll change the government, and they did. So far, the Iranians and others have not, but that's the intent. It's regime change is the intent. So the sanctions are technically legal from the U.S. point of view, but are not sanctioned under international law, and the European and other signatories to the JCPOA don't agree with the U.S. moving out of this treaty and don't agree with the U.S. imposition of sanctions, but they haven't fought back enough to develop an alternative means of trading with Iran outside of the U.S. sanctioned system. And this is what the Iranians are complaining about. That is, it's not just the U.S. that's not living up to its obligations under this agreement, but the Europeans and others as well, because they are hogtied by the U.S. banking system and the international dollar system. So the Iranians have moved, mostly symbolically, to exceed the limits that were placed on their stockpiling of nuclear materials under the JCPOA, but it's basically symbolic. They're not moving. There's no evidence that they're moving, in fact, to a nuclear weapon. Specters remain within the country, not only under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but under the additional protocol that's even more stringent. So, again, the nuclear issue, which you hear about all the time, is mostly bogus, as far as I'm concerned. And of course, we know there's only one, there are actually two nuclear powers in the Middle East. One is Israel, and the other is the US. It has nuclear weapons at its bases in the Middle East. Iran, like all the other countries in the Middle East, except for Israel, is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and they're on record, again, along with all the countries in the Middle East, except Israel, with the support of the US, in favor of the Middle East being a nuclear weapons-free zone. And this is not just a fantasy, this exists under UN treaties. The Pacific, South America, most of Africa are considered nuclear weapons-free zones under the UN. And so this could happen, but the US and Israel have blocked it in terms of the Middle East. So try not to get too wrapped up in the nuclear issue. That's a ploy. It's more of a ploy for promoting our hostility to Iran rather than a practical threat. Yeah.
Jeff, I'm trying to fit an economic piece into this whole wonderful puzzle you put together. And hear me out, but then correct me if I'm wrong. When the U.S. was taking all this cheap oil out of the Middle East, that was one part of the process, but they were bringing it to the United States to be refined. It was the United States where the refining and distribution and the setting of prices took place. So one example of that was in the 70s, when I drove out here from California on 27 cents a gallon in 1972, in my little VW bug. So, but then a few years later, there's this horrible inflation of the prices of oil and everything else that has not ceased since then. And the blame was put on OPEC for limiting distribution, how much they would produce. However, it was still, the distribution and prices were still controlled in the United States through the refineries. And that period of inflation, particularly for consumer goods, oil, and the lowering of wages in this country has never gone back to the old days. So I keep looking for this piece to put the economic incentive in here.
So I don't know that that's correct, that a lot of Middle Eastern oil is refined in the U.S. There are large refinery facilities in Saudi Arabia, Iran, and so on. But it is true that most of the oil coming from the Middle East went to Europe and Japan and China, not the U.S. But because there's a world market for oil, it's fungible, as they say. If the price is higher in one place, it gets to be high in the other place too, because the producers of oil will sell to the highest for the highest price wherever they can get it. So when the OPEC, the oil producers, instituted their price revolution, which doubled and tripled, and then more the price of oil, which was practically free. In other words, they were getting peanuts for it. The price of oil here went up significantly also. And in this crisis, the price of oil may go up again. The key thing is that the producers and exporters of all this oil denominated their exports in US dollars and recirculated most of the profits into the purchase of US Treasury notes, in effect, so that the US could sort of profit off of this Middle Eastern oil with no balance of payments issue. Basically, they paid us to pay them to use their oil. And never mind the profit, the huge profits that were made by US oil service companies and arms manufacturers. So even though the U.S. was exporting, even today, where the U.S. Makes more oil and gas than it needs, because of the nature of the international market, we export oil and import oil, because it's just more convenient the way the sort of international transportation goes. Most of the oil from Alaska goes to Asia, goes to Japan and China, while the U.S. still, at least until recently, imported oil from Venezuela to the Gulf Coast. And a lot of the oil that we use in New England is imported because it's cheaper for the oil companies to import New England oil from abroad than to ship it from the ports in the Gulf. Because if you ship it from the Gulf, port to port, U.S. transportation has to go under U.S. flag ships with highly paid union crews. And so it's expensive to ship oil from Mobile, Alabama to Boston, much cheaper to ship oil from Angola or Guinea or the Middle East to Boston under Panamanian or Seychelles flag ships with international crews of mostly impoverished union-free sailors. So that's the way the oil, and by the way, until recently, under the Trump administration, in response to the oil shock in the 1970s, it was against the law to export U.S. oil. And that changed under Trump. So now we export and import oil at the international price. So it's complicated. The whole economy of oil is complicated, but it doesn't change the fact that in theory, the U.S. itself does not need Middle Eastern oil. And is not a net user of Middle Eastern oil.
I have a question.
Are there different oils, like is there like a heavy oil? and-
There are. So Venezuela, the heavy oils in Venezuela are, used to be, I'm not sure today, used to be refined primarily in the Gulf because the equipment, the U.S. Gulf states, the equipment is different. The heavy crude oil in Venezuela requires a different refining technology than the light crude oils in the Middle East. So that was one reason why Venezuela exported most of its oil to the U.S. and then it was re-exported as refined products in the Gulf. I wanted to tell a little personal story because we have two of my union sisters from GE. So during this period when the U.S. was backing Saddam Hussein in his attack against Iran, I was working in the turbine division at GE. There were two big divisions in GE. One made steam turbines for ships and power plants. The other made jet engines for mostly military aircraft. And over the years, when I was in the turbine division, most of the civilian work went away little by little, and what was left was mostly work for the U.S. Navy. So I had the dubious distinction of working on Trident submarines, U.S. nuclear aircraft carriers, and so on. But one of the last civilian projects I worked on, which was about 1983, was two GE power plants for Saddam Hussein. And they were called Iraq 1 and Iraq 2, and this was one of my last civilian jobs at Building 64. Ironically, across the way in the aircraft division, they made the engine for F-18 fighter planes, which bombed the power plants that we built for Saddam Hussein. And then GE now has contracts to rebuild power plants in Iraq, not from Lynn or Schenectady, but from foreign sources, international consortiums of Japanese and European firms. But they're profiting. So they profited building power plants for Saddam Hussein, bombing them, and now rebuilding them again. And, so that's, we have a personal connection with Saddam Hussein. I made significant amount of overtime working on those Iraq power plants.
Stealth bomber too.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Where does Russia and China figure in with Iran?
So, they both have good relations with Iran. They still have difficulty, of course the Russians don't need to import oil, the Chinese do, and they still have some difficulties getting around the U.S. sanctions, but they have friendly relations with Iran. And the Russians have friendly relations with almost everybody in the Middle East, which is a kind of remarkable feat. One of the reasons why we like to say anything bad going on in the Middle East has to do with the Russians, because frankly, they're better at diplomacy in the Middle East, much better than we are. So uniquely, the Russians are on good terms with the government of Syria, the government of Turkey, the government of Iran, the government of Saudi Arabia, and even the government of Israel, which is a kind of difficult, trifecta or quadrifecta to establish, because it's understood that, of course, the Russians have their own interests in the Middle East, but they are not a potential imperial hegemon in the Middle East. Everybody understands that. So they deal with their partners in the Middle East much more on a basis of equality and mutual respect than people are used to from the U.S. And therefore, they can get along with everybody. And of course, I don't think we're going to get very far into the Syrian question. They are, actually key in terms of the defense of Syria, and will be probably in the defense of Iran. They are offering anti-missile, anti-aircraft technology to Iran, which will probably be taken up. They already sold the S-400 anti-aircraft system to Turkey, our NATO ally, which is leading to a real fracture in NATO, and probably eventually Turkey will leave NATO. They have, in effect, already done it, but it hasn't happened yet. So there are competitors, and they don't have the same interest in the Middle East that we have, and they want to do business. And they're pretty good at it, especially the Chinese. So the potential little by little, as parts of the Middle East break free from U.S. control, and of course, it's a very hopeful sign that the U.S. troops will be ejected from Iraq. It's not clear that that's going to happen. That vacuum will be filled by the Russians and the Chinese on a commercial level, especially the Chinese who are have large construction and industrial projects throughout the developing world, and will continue that. Something you don't hear about very much. So, thank you for that question.
I don't know if this is something you know a lot about, Jeff, but there was an item in the paper yesterday about how if Iraq would kick out the U.S. troops, the U.S. would cut off the oil clearance accounts in New York. And you also earlier mentioned the economic, the dollar-denominated economic control. How does that financial control work, and what is the response of the other major countries in the world to that continuing financial control?
I can't say I know it in detail, but basically because oil sales are denominated in dollars, ultimately they flow through U.S.-controlled banks. And therefore, there's a kind of a choke point in international commerce that comes because of that. So the U.S. has threatened sanctions against Iraq. Remember, U.S. troops returned to Iraq in 2014 after they were withdrawn from Obama because the Iraqis agreed to let the U.S. in to help them fight against the Islamic State, ISIS, that was taking over a good part of Iraq. But they're there under the sufferance of the Iraqi government. The Iraqi parliament has voted to ask the U.S. troops to leave, and the prime minister has agreed to that, and the U.S. is so far saying we're not necessarily going to do it. And their response was, let's talk about our ongoing military collaboration, not any nonsense like getting U.S. troops out. How that will play out, I don't know. But Trump already has threatened sanctions against Iraq, including to have them pay for the cost of the U.S. military bases in Iraq that came after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So to pay for their labors. That's not going to happen for sure. But the U.S. can do damage to countries. The U.S. economy, although it's the second largest in the world now, because of the dollar, it just can hurt countries very badly. And the nature of the global economic system is that the ties and the supply routes and the trade is a complicated net of connections that can be blocked at different points. And the U.S. has the ability to do that in the short run. So it's not an idle threat that they can hurt Iraq in the short run. And Iraq is less economically viable even than Iran, because Iran has a domestic industry, agriculture and so on. Iraq much less so. So I don't know how it'll play out. But the hopeful scenario is that this will be the first domino in the removal of U.S. military presence in the Middle East. And the other really encouraging sign is that the Saudis, who have been, and the Emiratis, who have been agitating over a long time for more U.S. confrontation with Iran, now that it's possible to be happening for real at their own doorstep, they have been mum in this crisis. Normally, you will hear, the Saudis are cheering on, quiet, completely quiet. They are in a panic over this because they would be in the front line of any war with Iran, and frankly, despite their purchase of billions and billions and billions of dollars of U.S. arms, they can't fight very well. The Iranians would whip their asses probably in any regional battle, even though the Saudis, in theory, have much better weapons. They don't care to fight very much. In fact, even in Yemen, the troops on the ground, the Saudi troops on the ground, are largely mercenaries from Sudan and other countries, because the Saudis have it pretty good. They're not anxious to sacrifice their palaces and their way of life to go fight and die in Yemen or anyplace else. So, and of course, the Iranian attack or Yemeni attack, maybe with Iranian support, on the Saudi oil facilities last summer was also a warning shot that the whole Saudi and Gulf oil infrastructure is vulnerable to destruction from Iran if a full-scale war breaks out. And even Israel, which of course cheers at any time the U.S. Exercises its military power in the Middle East, especially against Iran, they've been kind of quiet lately because they're worried if they get drawn into a general war, Israel itself is pretty vulnerable to military attacks from Lebanon under Hezbollah, which has a kind of deterrence now against Israel, kind of unique. It's the first time an Arab armed force effectively has military deterrence against Israel. So they've been quiet about it too. They don't want to be drawn into it. And that's partly why, probably why Trump kind of stepped down in the short run, because his allies in the Middle East did not want a general war. And they feared it more than the Iranians, frankly. So, you know, time will tell. The Israelis, of course, are, you know, you can't understand U.S. policy toward Iran unless you know about Israel, frankly. It's Israeli hostility to Iran. Sorry I'm going on, but this is something I forgot to mention. The Israeli hostility to Iran, which is discussed in the context of the threat of a nuclear weapon for Iran, really has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. Iran is the last major potent military adversary of Israel in the Middle East. And even in 2003, when the Israelis were very much promoting the U.S. attack on Iraq, they made it very clear that their real priority was an attack on Iran. And that they somewhat reluctantly supported and argued for the war on Iraq on the theory that at least if we started a war, Iran would be next. But that was their preferred thing. You remember the neocons were in the first flush of the attack on Iraq, believed this was the first stop to a general conflagration in the Middle East in which every U.S. adversary would be overthrown. As they said, anyone can go to Baghdad, real men want to go to Tehran. And that hasn't changed since then, because even in 2003, as a result of the very punishing Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s, the first Gulf War, and the U.S. sanctions, Iraq was already a spent force militarily. It was not a threat against Israel. Iran was. So the Israelis agreed, okay, we'll support the war in Iraq and we'll hope Iran is next. And, you know, of course, it never happened, luckily, because the Iranians, I think largely defensively, tied the U up in a war of attrition within Iraq, supporting militias, local militias, and encouraging and organizing them. Soleimani played a role in that, that made the U.S. so tied up in Iraq they didn't have the wherewithal to expand the war to Iran. That was a defensive move that was very significant.
What do you think might have happened in Iran? You know, before they took out Soleimani, there were always protests against the Iranian government. The Iranian government was running out of money to support the Hezbollah. They were starting to get tired of it. And, you know, that to me was not
Yeah, you know, look,
what do you think might, if we hadn't done that, was there a chance that?
I mean, it certainly seems to be the case that whenever there is opposition to a less than perfectly democratic regime in the Middle East, the U.S. supplies a worse alternative. And that's certainly true in Syria, which I guess we're not going to get to. So people in Iran, many of whom, not clear that it's a majority, many of whom want reforms and oppose the government, certainly don't think that they can achieve democracy in Iran through U.S. intervention. When the U.S. ramps up tensions in Iran, it tends to unify the Iranians on national grounds, even though they have misgivings, many of them have misgivings about their own government and the sort of repressive Islamic cultural environment. So Iranians are now, you know, more united than they were before this assassination. You know, millions and millions went out in the streets. And I don't know if you heard or watched on TV, you know, there were a few U.S. reporters in Iran during that period, and their sort of handlers in the United States kept trying to probe, isn't this all people just organized by the government and sort of bust into the streets? And there are people on the ground who said, no, that's crazy. These are millions of people that are coming out, that are crying, weeping in the streets because this guy was a hero. So in a way, the U.S., every time the U.S. attacks a country, it reinforces the existing government rather than reforming.
Right, I understand, but I just wonder what you thought the chances were of the, you know.
I don't know. Honestly, it's hard to know. I mean, certainly the government in Iran has opposition. How big it is and what the percentage is, I tend to think, based on the elections and so on, and especially the recent events, that the majority, even with some misgivings, supports the government. They do vote. You know, they have elections that matter, and things change. So it's hard to know. It's hard to know. It's certainly not a perfect democracy, but they have elections that matter some, but not entirely. And we might, before we point the finger at them, we might ask about our own elections, which matter some, but not 100% either, because both parties often support policies, especially in the Middle East, that don't change regardless of which one gets elected. And that's something like the situation in Iran, to my mind. That is, certain questions are not up for choice in elections. A lot of them are, but some are not. And that's the same in our country too, and in most countries that are called democracies. Yeah.
Jeff, who is supplying weapons to Iran? Where do they get their from?
They mostly indigenous.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Oh, so who is supplying weapons to Iran? Iran has a very advanced indigenous military infrastructure. Remember, the Iranians have a high level of technology within their countries. Before the Shah, especially, I mean, tens of thousands of Iranians studied science and engineering in the United States and other countries, and their missile technology is indigenous, you know, basically, and they have, you know, a real industrial capacity that's different from, you know, Iraq or Saudi Arabia or most other places in the Middle East, and in fact, they export weapons, advanced weapons, particularly to Hezbollah in Iraq and Lebanon, which is one of the reasons why the Israelis are kind of laying low right now. As far as I know, Iran is mostly self-sufficient in military. They do have a lot of old U.S. hardware that goes back to the 70s, some of which is still functional on some level. They still fly U.S. F-4 Phantom jets that have been kept in the air by cannibalizing other ones, and they still have the U.S. tanks. But their military power is mostly in missile technology, because they know they don't have a chance in sort of meeting the U.S. face to face and, you know, conventional air power, but they do have locally made missiles that can reach anywhere in the Middle East. Yeah.
What do you think about Putin and Merkel representing the EU saying they're going to stick with the nuclear deal?
Well, all the signatories besides the United States say they want to stick to the nuclear deal. The problem is they're not willing to take on the United States to allow Iran to trade and get out of sanctions, as was the promise in the nuclear deal. So it's partly, whether that will happen or not, I don't know, but this issue where every little while you hear the Iranians exceeded this limit in the JCPOA, or are reopening this power plant, or starting enrichment here, it's a kind of incremental thing that says, you know, either you put up, or we're out of it too, you know, that to the Europeans. And they're scrambling. They want to keep this deal going, but have not either had the courage or the means to get around the U.S. sanctions against Iran. And that's the situation today. It's not that Iran is breaking out toward nuclear weapons. They are exceeding some of the sort of technical limits in the JCPOA, which are symbolic, mostly. But they're saying, these are the stakes. You know, you want to keep this agreement, we're not going to keep it unilaterally. If you're not going to play your part by allowing us to export oil, we're not going to keep our part either. And it's sort of part of this sort of pressure campaign that's two-way. Yeah?
What are some key points about Syria that you wanted to communicate to us?
Well, I can talk about Syria a little bit, if you want. A previous slide showed the response to the Soleimani assassination in other countries in the Middle East. That has its ramifications in Syria as well. And as you might suggest, not be surprised, the opposition to the Syrian government, the rebels, were celebrating. The puppet government, there's a Syrian National Council which operates out of Istanbul and is essentially a Turkish puppet government. They celebrated. In the government-held parts of Syria, people are demonstrating outrage, the same as in Iran and Iraq and so on. This was a demonstration in Aleppo after the killing. And maybe I'll just start to introduce about Syria a little bit. If you have patience to stay a little bit longer?
Yes.
Okay, so I know some of you have done as best you can to follow what goes on in Syria, but you have to understand the media coverage of that country is so one-sided and so distorted that unless you have the time and the ability to go into it much more deeply and independently, you can't really understand what's going on there. And as an example, this was the cover of an issue of The Economist magazine, which shows a caricature of what most people think is going on. That is, Bashar al-Assad, this monster, is standing astride the ruins of his country. He's a vicious dictator, hated by all his people, who has slaughtered them and destroyed. The country is in ruins. He has no support among his people. This is a sort of stereotype that mostly is repeated in the mainstream media and in the arts, the Academy Awards, I mean, in a million different ways. And all of that is either entirely or at least partly wrong. The government of Syria is not democratic. And as in Iran, it's not required that if you oppose U.S. policy toward that country, it doesn't mean you have to sort of idolize the governments that they have. Syria is ruled not individually by Bashar al-Assad, but by a sort of collective authoritarian regime based on the Syrian Ba'ath Socialist Party. Bashar al-Assad is not an individual dictator. He's the chairman of the board of the inner circle of the Ba'ath Party that rules Syria with considerable support from Syrians. Not everyone, of course, Syrians are divided, but the idea that the government of Syria has no support from its people is an absurdity. It would be long gone if that were the case. For example, before the war, Syria had a population of about 21 million. There were 2 million members of the Ba'ath Party. And even though many of them were opportunists, as it happens in authoritarian countries, this is a way to get ahead, still there was a mass base of support for the regime. Because if you imagine 2 million party members, their families and relatives and so on, this is a considerable number of people. And Syria has suffered a great deal. This is a picture I took a few years ago in Homs, which was a scene of very heavy fighting. This is part of eastern Aleppo. But it's also true that a lot of Syria is intact. Syria is a country with a very deep cultural history, and a lot of it survives intact. And I don't know if this video will play. This is a somewhat giddy video. I'm not very good at the music, but what it shows is this is Syria within the last year or so. And most of it is filmed in Aleppo, which to your mind was a city that was destroyed completely in the war. And of course, not everybody, it doesn't mean everybody is living high on the hog in Syria, but for millions of Syrians, life goes on. I mean, Damascus and most of Aleppo are completely intact. Hama is completely intact. Latakia, Tartus on the coast are completely intact. So this idea of Syria being a ruin because of its own government is an exaggeration. And And again, not that all Syrians have access to nice hotels and swimming pools, but you can see as it pans around, this is a city that you all think was destroyed by the Syrian government. So let me go on. And as a reminder, yes, the war, the civil war, it's partly a civil war, partly an intervention, has caused a lot of damage, but it wasn't the Syrian government that was the only perpetrator. This is a view over Raqqa, a major Syrian city in the east central part of the country that, like Mosul, was bombed by the U.S. To attack ISIS, and it was leveled completely, not by Bashar al-Assad, but by the U.S. Air Force. Personally, so what do I know about Syria? I've been to Syria 3 times. Once in 2010 before the war, when it was pretty normal to travel from Beirut to Jordan via Damascus. Actually, in normal time, in peacetime, Beirut is about an hour's drive to Damascus and then about another hour's drive to the Jordan border. That was a pretty normal way to travel. Can't do that today because the area around the Jordan border is not very safe. And then I went in 2016 with an international group that was organized by pro-Syrian Palestinians. And again in 2018, that was organized by an American group. And in 2016, the group I was with, we were among the first foreigners to visit Palmyra, which had just been retaken. It had been occupied by ISIS earlier in 2015 and 16. And we visited while Russian engineers were still blowing up mines and booby traps in the ruins. So this is Syria, just to get you oriented a little bit. Most of the cities are in this sort of north-south line, and most of the population. You have Daraa, Damascus, Homs, Hama, Aleppo are the major cities, and this is where most Syrians live. Outside of this area, Raqqa is a major city, Deir ez-Zor, and Hasaka in this area, but in between, the population is pretty light. This area in central and eastern Syria is pretty lightly populated. So even at the low point of the Syrian government fate during the war, it still controlled most of the population centers. Now it's sort of overwhelming. 85 or 90% of the Syrian population lives in territory controlled by the government. So, I don't know how far we're going to go, but in Syria, as in the rest of the Middle East, you absolutely cannot understand what's going on today unless you know something about the colonial history in the region. And even though this is ancient history for many of us, it's not ancient history for the people who live in the region. It's very much living history. So, I've written a lot, some of you know, I've written a lot about the Middle East, various parts of the Middle East. But I have to say I'm very proud of this article, which was originally in Counterpunch, and then, without my knowledge, was translated into Arabic and published in a Jordanian newspaper a few months later. And I heard about it because someone wrote to me and said, "We saw your article in Al-Ghad," which means tomorrow in Amman. And so people in the Middle East certainly get it, right? It's news to us. It's old news to them. And I've shown this before, but the colonial history of the Middle East is one of the things that is hiding in plain sight. And I would ask you to consider, why do we call this region the Middle East? The Earth is round. I think most people in this room agree. So that it has a North Pole and a South Pole, because it has an axis. But it doesn't have an east or a west. East and west are directions around the globe. They're not places. The answer to that question, why it's the Middle East, is colonialism. So by 1900 or so, the colonial powers had taken over almost all of Africa, southern and eastern Asia. And the U.S., of course, was in the colonial game in Hawaii, Alaska, and the Philippines, but not in this part of the world. And from their point of view, in Europe, this was the East, this was the Far East, this was the Middle East, or the Near East, as it's sometimes called. So the very name of the region is an artifact of colonialism. And it's so embedded now,
Yeah.
like America, even the local people in the Arab language use the term Middle East, even